Thank you.
Dear colleagues and speakers, good morning, good afternoon. On behalf of UNEP and UNDP, welcome to this webinar on artisanal and small-scale gold mining. My name is Tim Scott. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor with UNDP in New York, and I will be your moderator today. This is the third in a series of webinars on chemicals and waste management beyond 2020. And as many of you know, all stakeholders involved in the strategic approach to international chemicals management are developing an ambitious post-2020 global framework. This new global framework will be adopted at the fifth session of the ICCM, known as ICCM5. This webinar series is designed to inform the new global framework by sharing information, knowledge, and good practices on sound chemicals and waste management for sustainable development. Now, the government of Germany will host ICCM5, and this webinar series is being organized through a project supported by BMU. That's the German Ministry of Environment, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety. And we are grateful to Germany, of course, for their leadership and for this support. Today's webinar is organized jointly by UNEP and UNDP and will be focusing on mercury management in artisanal and small-scale gold mining. And as we'll hear in just a moment from our speakers, artisanal and small-scale gold mining, or ASGM, is a nexus area in which chemicals management is very closely linked to poverty reduction, to gender, health, and of course, nature, including in the green recovery context. Now, before I introduce our first expert, let me just take care of a few housekeeping announcements. Please know that we are recording this webinar, and both the recording and all speaker presentations will be shared online afterwards. You can find a link in the chat box where this information will be made available. Now, we're looking forward to an interactive discussion, so I encourage all of you to share your comments and questions in the chat box throughout our webinar, and we'll be moderating the chat box and coming to some of your comments in the discussion session towards the end of the webinar. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Ms. Evelyn Swain from the GEF Secretariat, who will be sharing opening remarks. Evelyn, we're looking forward to your insights. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you so much to UNDP for inviting me to introduce this session today. I come from the GEF Secretariat, which is the financial mechanism for the Minamata Convention on Mercury. ASGM is one of the important areas that we support under our work on mercury. I think you'll hear through the next few speakers about the GEF-funded Planet Gold program. Ludovic and Susan lead that program, and it will be especially nice to hear from two of our project countries themselves, Indonesia and Ecuador. So I won't go into too much detail on that. However, I will just say that the fact that the GEF is set up to deal with multiple environmental issues, including biodiversity loss, land degradation, international waters, climate change, and chemicals under one roof makes it particularly effective at dealing with issues like ASGM, where not only do we need to address mercury pollution, but also other unintended consequences of mining, like degradation to habitat loss that often occurs in biodiversity-rich areas like the Amazon. ASGM is one of the largest sources of mercury contamination globally, responsible for 37% of emissions. So you see, this is a very significant global environmental issue, which is why the GEF is involved. However, perhaps more importantly, it's an economic and a livelihoods issue. While the numbers can vary because it's an informal sector, as many as 15 to 20 million people are employed in ASGM, including 4.5 million women and over 600,000 children. If you include family members supported by the sector, the number jumps up to 100 million people who depend on ASGM for their livelihoods. Therefore, the actions to reduce exposure to toxic levels of mercury in this sector have clear linkages to poverty elimination, addressing gender imparities, and protecting children. Through the Planet Gold program, we are trying to empower the sector to be more sustainable, legitimize illegal miners through formalization, give miners access to finance and the capital that they really need to go mercury-free, provide technology options, and build a platform or a global community to share what's working and also, really importantly, what's not working. UNDP and UNEP, the organizers of our event today, have clear roles to play in this critical environmental and development issue, which we'll hear about later. The work on ASGM can serve as an excellent example of tackling other chemicals and waste issues, and also other environmental issues with a socioeconomic focus. One area where the GOLD program has been particularly effective is working with the private sector to ensure that we consider each part of the supply chain. Other issues can benefit from taking a similar approach. And in fact, we are proposing some shifts in our next GEF 8 strategy to better support this kind of integrated programming. Finally, let me just recognize the context that brings us to this webinar today, which is the sound management of chemicals and waste beyond 2020 and the SciChem process. Now that we have the new Minamata Convention on mercury, it can be easy to forget that mercury was once managed under SciChem. And in fact, some of the GEF's initial support to ASGM sector came under the SciChem window of funding. I'd say that SciChem's multi-sectoral approach is very fitting for this issue, especially in the way that the private sector and CSOs have a solid seat at the table in the SciChem process. I hope that learning about the GOLD's program work can provide valuable lessons to other issues and concern to be tackled post-2020. With that, let me just say what an interesting program we have to look forward to today. Thank you, and I very much look forward to this discussion.
Evelyn, thanks so much. That was excellent. What a great start. Thanks very much for the work that you're leading with the GEF Secretariat on artisanal mining through the Planet Gold program. And thanks for your presentation. You really helped to frame our discussion today and highlight the links not only between gold mining, poverty, and gender mainstreaming, of course, but also engagement with the private sector and across value chains. Thank you very much. Let me now introduce our next speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Ludovic Bordenaudat with UNEP, who will be sharing with us an overview of the ASGM sector and its linkages to sustainable development. Over to you, Ludovic.
Thank you, Tim. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to participate to this webinar together with UNDP today to show, how and discuss how we can work together to really address a sector that's really impacting on our environment, but also has very high potential positive impact to the lives of the miners that are involved. Next slide, please. So first, a few background issues, and I tried to put quite a bit of pictures so that you can really understand, the areas where the sector is operating. It's a very rural sector operating in very remote areas. And it is the largest user and emitter of mercury to the environment. We're talking of 1,400 metric tons of mercury that is used and emitted to the environment by the sector annually. It's emitted to the water, to soils, and to air, to the atmosphere. So it is a very important sector when we consider environmental degradation. The second and the most obvious environmental degradation that is also linked to any mining activity, open pit, is the destruction of habitat, deforestation. As you can see in the bottom picture here, it's encroachment into protected areas. This photo was taken in Ghana. and the informality of the sector. A lot of these miners are not in the formal economy, and they do not operate in the formally. Next slide, please. So why is mercury used? Why is it the sector is the largest user of mercury? Well, first of all, mercury is very easy to find. Even in these remote areas, there are value chains that bring mercury to the miners because there is a demand. It's very cheap. Mercury is 1,000 times cheaper than gold. So when you talk about, trying to control the use of mercury in the sector by playing on the price of mercury, its availability, it's unlikely to work very easily because mercury is so cheap. Miners have no training in mining. Most of them are farmers or in rural areas that have come to the sector because the price of gold has increased dramatically over the last 20 years. It used to be $250 an ounce in 2000. It is now over 10 times that amount. But they don't know, they don't have any mining training. So what they do is they use the easiest way that can be used to extract gold, which is mercury amalgamation. They are not formalized, so it's very difficult for them to acquire the equipment they would need to produce gold more cleanly, because these equipments cannot be carried away every day on your back. The equipments require a formalized area that with fixed equipment. Also, the use of gold amalgamation allows miners to produce gold daily. It means that they can have an income daily. And this is quite important for informal population of workers, because they do need this daily income. And of course, they're not aware of the risks, so they don't know. If you don't know mercury is dangerous, then there's no reason for you to stop using it. So that's a big, these are the main barriers and the main reasons why it's used. It's a very ancient technique. It's very easy, and it's somehow moderately efficient. So that's why they use it. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, mercury is released at both at two steps during the process, during amalgamation. And here we have a picture where these mills that are motor driven are filled with metal bars or metal balls and the ore to crush the ore. And the miners also, because they don't know about mining techniques, you often add a lot of mercury to this process, whereas it should be done separately. I think mercury in the process is very inefficient. The mercury has very little chance of capturing the gold. So it leads to a lot of gold ending up in the tailings and not being recovered at all. And it leads to very large amount of mercury released to the environment and to the water. The second step is during the amalgamation. So once you have reached an amalgam, which is composed of half gold, half mercury, miners burn it in the open so that the mercury gets into vapor phase and you're left with the gold. This process is very simple. In this process, you release roughly 1 part mercury for 1 part of gold that you produce. It is quite an important source. And the problem is that it's done, as you can see in the picture, with the family watching. So all these people are being exposed to mercury vapors. Next slide, please. There are alternatives to the previous pictures. First of all, as I mentioned, you need to separate the grinding process, the separation of the gold from the ore, which is called grinding, and the processing later. So in this picture, you can see that we have installed here a mill that will continuously mill the ore, and sieves at the exits of these mills that will allow you to filter the size of particles, because when you have particles of the same size, it's easy then to separate the gold. And then you have several techniques to achieve this separation through a sluice, like it's done at the end of this mill on the picture. or through, and it can be combined with vibrating or shaking tables that will do a finer separation. And you can see on the top right photo that you can see some gold towards the left side of what comes out of the table. So it's a very efficient way to concentrate the ore. And it's clean. This process doesn't use chemicals at all, like gold amalgamation. And with this process, we've achieved in particular cases, in Burkina Faso, for example, in 2012, we had set up these equipments, and we enable the miners to recover 70 to 75% of the gold in the ore without using chemicals, whereas with mercury previously, they were only recovering about 30%. So we doubled their recovery, which was a big impact to these mining communities, knowing that the whole of this equipment cost about $40,000, which at the time was 1 kilogram of gold, which they could produce easily with this increased recovery within a few months. So really the price of the equipment is not the issue here. They have the money to do it if they do produce more gold. The problem is the formalization and the access to these equipments. Next slide, please. So apart from these environmental impacts of the mining, artisanal and small-scale gold mining, we have to realize and we have to keep in mind that's where it's important for us to link up, UNEP, UNDP and other partners. This sector is a unique employment opportunity for rural population. In this area, there is no alternative livelihood apart from farming, and often these miners are also farmers. So bringing in a new way, a new livelihood would be very difficult. It is possible, as we've shown in the previous picture, to extract gold in an environmentally friendly way. Of course, it's an extractive industry. You will always have an environmental impact, but you can reduce that impact that is in a way that it's manageable, and you can absolutely remove the use of chemicals at the mining site as much as possible. And when it's well managed, it's a very good way to transfer wealth from rich people to poor people. It is one of the commodity where the price paid for gold at the mining site, if they have produced gold in the proper way, this price is about 90 to 95% of what we pay if you go to a bank to buy gold. So there is very little price value lost along the value chain. And then we can transfer, we can empower this population, this rural population. And as Evelyn said, we're not talking about a few thousands of people involved in this sector. This is 20 million miners worldwide involved in this activity. So it's a very good way to address poverty alleviation. Next slide, please. So a lot of us have been active for 40 years, not me, but on this sector to try to solve the issues that we've seen, the issues of lack of awareness, lack of formalization, and lack of access to technologies. In 2007, UNEP set up the Global Mercury Partnership with the support of governments. And in this Global Mercury Partnership, we have an area on artisanal and small-scale gold mining, which is led by UNIDO, UNEP, and NRDC. So Susan and I have been leading this area, this partnership area since the beginning, since 2007. And currently we have 92 partners from academia, member states, be it donors or beneficiaries, NGOs and individual experts that are communicating on their respective activities around the world so that we have a better collaboration and less overlap of activities and really making use of the funds that we have each. And the activities of these partners range from, introducing mercury-free technologies, improving access to finance, because to buy this equipment, although they can pay it fast. They still need access to the finance to buy the equipment. Working on value chains together with OECD, also addressing the issue of mercury trade. And some of our partners are even working on remediation of former sites. Next slide, please. This slide will show you a demonstration of how broad the range of activities of our partners are. So the sector is active in over 60 countries, 60 to 70 countries around the world. And our last meeting, these were the countries where partners have current activities. So that's our ongoing activities for more of our partners. That's why it's important to communicate and know if we are to go to work in Ecuador or Peru, who is already working there and how we can maximize our activities. Next slide, please. This is my second last slide. On top of the Global Mercury Partnership, the international community also developed the Minamata Convention from 2010-2013. And the convention has now entered into force and has a lot of countries have taken steps to implement the convention and respond to their obligations in this convention. One important aspect of the convention is that there is an article that is dedicated to ASGM in the convention. This is the only sector that is really highlighted as a separate sector in the convention. And it's reflecting the fact that it is the largest user and emitter of mercury to the environment. So Article 7 deals with ASGM. In this article, it says that countries that have ASGM in their territory need to take steps to reduce this mercury use. Additionally, if the countries think that this sector is more than insignificant, in other words, if they think the sector is important in their national economy and in their territory, then they have the obligation to develop a national action plan. And the GEF has financed over 40 national action plans so far. Some of them have been completed and are available in the Minamata Convention website, which are really plans for national activities to reduce mercury use. And on top of providing funding from this National Action Plan, the GEF is also funding activities and large projects that are addressing the use of mercury in the sector. And that will be the topic of the next presentation, which Susan, my colleague in the partnership, will provide. Next and last slide, please. And as was mentioned in the introduction, the sector is a rural activity that can really be a key actor in poverty alleviation in rural areas in many countries of the world, with an active working population of 15 to 20 million, but beneficiaries that are going over 100 million people around the world. And of course, this sector, if properly managed, so that's what we see here on the left, contribute positively to most of the SDGs. If the sector remains informal and we remain in the situation that are shown in the first photos, then the sector negatively impacts a lot of these SDGs. So it's important that we all act together to make sure that the sector is formalized and the miners are provided the means to produce gold in an efficient manner, that they can recover as much gold as they can, and in that way have a positive impact on their development. These graphs were not produced by us. It's an example of the collaboration we have in the Global Mercury Partnership. They were produced by PACT. And so I have to give credit for this team to produce these two graphs. And thanks finally, so much, that's the last slide. So thank you very much. I'm available to comments, and I'll be available to answer questions later on.
Thanks so much, Ludwig. That was wonderful. Your presentation gave us some very good, very helpful background on the use of mercury in artisanal mining, and of course the women and men and farmers who rely on this type of mining for their livelihoods in the informal sector. And perhaps even more importantly, he showed us some of the alternative methods for extracting gold, not only more safely, but also more efficiently without chemicals. And how this opportunity side, shall we say, can help reduce poverty and environmental degradation, including through the partnerships that you outlined, the Global Mercury Partnership, and of course the work of the Minamata Convention. So that really helps set up our next series of speakers who will take us even more in depth. It's my pleasure now to introduce Ms. Susan Keene from the NRDC, also part of the Global Mercury Partnership Program. And Susan will be sharing with us a bit more about Planet Gold as an example of multi-stakeholder cooperation in chemicals and waste management. Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tim. So yes, I'll be giving a little bit more information about the Planet Gold program. Evelyn nicely gave us an overview sketch of it, but I just want to elaborate on some of the elements where we're really trying to enhance global cooperation around the ASGM sector so that we can really accelerate progress in the sector. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Planet Gold program is funded by the GEF. It is the current phase is led by UNEP, by Ludovic in particular, and is also implemented by a number of different implementing agencies, including UNDP, Conservation International, I know I'm forgetting someone, UNIDO, of course, and UNEP, of course. So we are all working together in each of the different country projects. But what we're trying to do is pull this all together and unify this with a common mission, which is to make small-scale gold mining safer, cleaner, and more profitable. And at the end of this program, we hope that we actually produce a clean supply of gold from small-scale miners that can be sold as responsible gold. And to do so, the program has a number of common elements across all the countries where it's implemented. So, of course, as Ludovic has commented many times, formalization is really the key, the foundation of creating this responsible supply chain. We need to help these miners become part of the formal economy, part of formal markets. So our program works on that. Through formalization, these miners will have greater access to finance. So all of our projects are working on different mechanisms, be it commercial finance, investment, revolving funds, microfinance, just a whole variety of finance mechanisms that respond to the wide variety of needs for finance within the sector. By having both formal status and access to finance, which helps them access improved technology, like the technology that Ludovic showed. This will hopefully allow these miners to also have greater access to formal markets, which will enhance their ability to get the price that Ludovic talked about. When it's done properly, they can get a really excellent price for their gold products. And they can also, just be part of the governments and their country's formal economy. So complementing these activity areas, of course, we complement all of this with awareness raising about the sector, stakeholder outreach across the value chain, and knowledge management, where we're trying to really capture the lessons learned and shared experience, not only across the different countries that participate in our program, but actually with the entire community of practice of small-scale mining across the world. Which is quite a large community. Next slide, please. These are the countries that are currently involved in the ones in gold are the ones that are currently involved in the Planet Gold program. You can see the list of countries here. In the interest of time, I won't name them, but these are the ones that the program began are approximately end of 2018, beginning of 2019, depending on the particular country. And then, as many of you probably know, there's also phase 2 in the works. The countries which are involved in phase 2 are highlighted in blue, and they're listed below. So this is a program that hopefully will go on for a while. We'll really expand across the different regions where ASGM is prevalent and is such an important source of livelihood, so that we can really get a lot of global momentum around the reduction of mercury and the formalization and professionalization of this sector. Next slide, please. So just to highlight the ways that we're cooperating within the Planet Gold program. So this is a program, not just a random collection of projects. Even though there are all those countries involved, as I mentioned, there's a common approach and common themes that all of the country projects work on in their level, in their group of activities. But in addition, there is a global project which seeks to be sort of a convening point and a way to both help information flow from the global community of practice, global experience, global knowledge to assist the national projects and their implementation needs. But also the flow certainly goes in the other direction. The experience from the national projects is something that we hope it is currently and will even more in the future contribute to the understanding of successful approaches to reducing mercury and improving the professionalization of the sector. So just a quick groups of categories. Of course, we have a knowledge repository. We're at the global level, we're developing different knowledge syntheses, tools, guidance documents, etc., that really try to give our country projects some information that they can practically use in their implementation. And as the country projects develop their information, we are actively collecting and documenting and putting that out and disseminating, making that available through our website and other means as well. In terms of the finance, finance is a big aspect of this particular phase of the program. And in the global project, we are working to educate and facilitate contact with international financial entities, as well as the global supply chain actors who are buying, who want to buy responsible gold at the end of our project. And then, of course, in the national projects, they're working with the actual project beneficiaries for producing such responsible gold. And through that connection, we hopefully will be building these responsible supply chains. Finally, as I mentioned, a big action is to really disseminate this information at the global level and also at the country level. We do have a number of partners who work at, who serve on our Planet Gold program advisory group that includes jewelers, financial entities, refiners, government entities, et cetera. And as Ludovic and Evelyn mentioned, this is an incredibly important connection within our program that really centers it in the demand for responsible gold worldwide. Next slide. The next phase, which I won't go into very much, this is going to be led by Conservation International. It will shift the focus a little in the formalization element of the program to try to pilot jurisdictional approaches to formalization. And for those of you who are not familiar with that term, these are really just using a focus on subnational jurisdictions and trying to get all the stakeholders engaged together to try to create a sustainable plan of action for moving forward, as well as for monitoring and evaluating the progress in formalizing the sector. So I'll leave more details on that to the question and answer period. Next slide, please. And so that's Planet Gold in a nutshell, and how we're really trying to create these connections and linkages and levels of cooperation, not only among the country projects, but with the global community and with the downstream buyers as well, to really enhance and accelerate action in the sector. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks very, very much. That was wonderful. I think you did a very good job of helping us understand more about the Planet Gold program and how the program is opening up opportunities for formalization and professionalization and access to a range of finance and markets for for their gold products. And thanks also for introducing us in a bit more detail to both the phase 1 and phase 2 Planet Gold country partners, and giving us that teaser, I guess, about the jurisdictional approach. For our participants, it would be great if you have any questions or comments to build on any of these excellent presentations, including questions, for example, about the jurisdictional approach, which we may come back to in our more interactive discussion period of this webinar. So thanks again very much, Susan. And that was an excellent segue, I think, to our next speaker, Ms. Dwi Krisnayanti, who is with UNDP in Indonesia, and who will be sharing with us some of the lessons learned on this formalization process of the ASGM sector that Susan, you just shared with us. So it's my pleasure now to give the floor to you, Dwi. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Tim. It's such great honor for inviting me as a speaker for this topic among other Planet Gold child country. Next slide, please. It's begun when our project document targeting us to support 60 ASGMs group in their formalization process. This formalization is leading to more sustainable income, opportunities, and safer working conditions, in addition of which 20% of the miners women. Next slide, please. Project is working at 6 project sites across Indonesia, where the perspective of local government and the way of local government implement the policy and regulation on the formalization for ASGM sector at each project sites are different. We received this conclusion after the project conducting assessment to address the policy and regulatory needs and gaps, overlaps, and also lack of clarity of those related policy and regulation. For example, formalization is understood as a process to ensure that ASGM's actors are licensed and organized in representative entities that represent their need, policy are implemented, monitor, and also enforce. And ASGM actor is expected to receive technical, administrative, and financial support that will empower them to adhere to requirements prescribed by national regulation. While legalization is understood as a process that ensures ASGM actor process to license and permit required by national law, means legalization is part of the formalization. Next slide, please. To emphasize the result, we understand that the process of formalization of ASM activities does not merely focus on the development and existence of legal, regulatory, and policy framework for ASM, but also on how it's successfully implemented, enforced, and in line with the local context and community. That is really important. Formalization also can be understood in the context of absorbing existing customary practice, which is developed informally by miners, into the mainstream of a country legal and economic affairs. In this regard, formalization does not only involve bureaucratic process, but also technical assistance from government to miner, so that miner can practice more sustainable mining activities. In this context, this is where project can play the role. Next slide, please. From the assessment result, the project defined what actually the project could do to support formalization. We came out that project could support the miner on the first one, establishment of miners cooperative. This is the first step because the miners cooperative is the holder of community mining permit. We are also encouraging the formation of women cooperative whose members are female miners and or wife of the miners. This is reflect to the project commitment to gender equality also and women empowerment with ASGM sector. At the same time, the project also capacitated the member of existing and newly established cooperatives with relevant knowledge and skill. These include non-mercury processing technology. We offering also business operation, financial management, and leadership. By this, the miners cooperatives are expected to have a self-sustenance to operate their business even after the project closure. Second is we are supporting issuance of community mining area as a spatial planning and small scale mining right, where the area is legal to be mined. The third one, we are supporting the issuance community mining permit. This is the important permit for small scale miners. The end of the formalization is for getting this permit. It's legal for mining and legal for processing the ore. The last one is we supporting issuance of industrial business license. This process will be doing after the miner receive community mining permit if they want to expand their processing business. This license has two categories, which are number of employees between less than 16 and more than 20 employees, and with total investment ranging from 1 to 15 billion rupiah. This is equal to 68,000 till 1 million US dollar. The process of those activities we could see from the 3-minute video that will be played after my presentations. Next slide, please. What is our lesson learned during the ASGM formalization within the project's location? The first one, to expand the project scope by facilitating the establishment of new cooperative to nearby project village. With regard to the project target of supporting 60 mining groups to obtain mining permit and processing licenses within the project location, we are realized that this number is not so easy to achieve. Responding to the situation, the project has extended its support to neighboring villages, which is permissible by the project document. The second lesson learned is we willing to assist the fulfillment of environmental permit. It's clearly mentioned in the law as one of the requirements. In this regard, the project assists the cooperatives to apply for the environmental permit pursuant to their future permit and application. The third one is we are to support the completion of community mining area proposal for the location that on process for getting the community mining area. This is occur to two of our project sites. The last one, for the lesson learned, we self-reflection and strategies. Nevertheless, the project reflects that meeting the formalization target based on number of mining groups supporting may not be easy. This self-reflection helped the project revisit its ability to meet the project target at the same time consider another route to achieve this target. Next slide, please. I do realize that regulation will be different from one to other countries, but I hope this presentation could broaden our perspective regarding issue and challenge on supporting formalization for ASGM sector. Thank you and enjoy the video. Over to you, Jim.
Dewey, thanks so much. That was great. Thanks for sharing more about lessons learned from the Planet Gold program in Indonesia, and specifically about efforts to formalize or to shift from the informal to the formal sector. You shared with us the importance of applying different approaches at different mining sites, and through the examples you gave us, how we can close the implementation gap between mining policies and their application in different communities and mining sites. The legalization process within the formalization process overall, including through mining and women cooperatives, and the links between community mining areas, spatial planning, and also permitting. So that was a wonderful deeper dive in just one of the phase 1 program countries. And now to complement that presentation, we're going to shift to our next speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Mario Rodas with UNDP in Ecuador, who will be sharing with us a bit more about access to finance for small-scale artisanal miners.
Tim, just before that, we have Dewey's video for play.
Yes, of course. Let the camera roll.
Okay, just give me 1 second. Thank you.
Formalization is an important step towards mercury reduction and elimination within artisanal and small-scale gold mining (ASGM) sector. In accordance to the law number 3, year 2020, the formalization phase is started with determination of a mining area (WP), followed with obtainment of a small-scale mining area (WPR), and issuance of a small-scale mining permit (IPR) for individuals and/or mining cooperatives that have met the required documents, including the Environmental Impact Analysis (EIA). The obtainment of a processing license (IUI) is another license shall be applied specifically for processing activities within the small-scale mining sector. In the above context, the Gold ISMEA project supports the WPR establishment through 2 steps, namely, recruiting a local expert with sufficient knowledge on small-scale mining sector and mining-related regulations. Within 6 months, the expert shall complete a technical study report through the following phases. Analyze the initial conditions of the proposed WPR area. Consult with the local governments and related stakeholders. Prepare a technical study regarding the geographical, geological, and land use conditions of the proposed WPR area. And submit the technical study report that has been approved by the local government, including the Provincial Office of Energy and Mineral Resources and Gold ISMEA project, prior to submission to the Regent and further conveyance to the Governor. Facilitating the local government, i.e. Provincial Office of Energy and Mineral Resources and related agencies, to self-conduct the WPR establishment. Within 3 to 4 months, the local government will conduct land use mapping, submit of an application letter for the determination of WPR proposal to be approved by the local government and community leaders. Obtain technical recommendations on the conformity of the proposed WPR with the Regional Spatial Plan, RTRWK, and recommendations from both the Regent and the Governor. Submit the WPR proposal to the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, MOEMR. Receive approval from the Ministry regarding the establishment of the proposed WPR. Issuance of the IPR through the following phases. Facilitate the establishment of miners' cooperatives as per the existing regulations with coordination of the local cooperative office. Recruit a local contractor who has relevant experience and own a certificate to prepare the EIA document and other supporting documents. Obtainment of IPR. Facilitating the issuance of IUI for gold processing facilities. The project recruits a contractor to fulfill the environmental permits and coordinates with the local government. The formalization within the ASGM sector shall be appropriate and in accordance to the needs of the miners by involving the local governments during the planning process. A clear procedure is needed to accelerate the formalization process.
A round of applause for that that fun video. Thanks, Dewey, and sorry for not getting it playing quite on time, but a very helpful video. And now again, we will just before reintroducing Mario, just to note that thanks for the question and answer in the chat box, and I do encourage all participants to feel free to come in any time to use that chat box function. So now again, moving from Indonesia to Ecuador, it's my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Mario Rodas to talk about access to finance. Over to you, Mario.
Thank you very much, Tim. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to present our experience in Ecuador with the finance to artisanal and small-scale miners. I will tell you about our job designing a financial mechanism and implementing a competitive fund mechanism. Next slide, please. This is some general information from Ecuador's mining sector based on information from 2018. There were around 30,000 people working in the mining sector, of which 82% are formal and 18% are in the informal sector. It should be noted that because of COVID-19 and because the mining cadastre has been closed since 2016, it is believed that the informal sector has been growing. The National Action Plan of Ecuador, which was presented to the Minamata Convention in May 2020, estimates a total use of mercury per year of 30 tons. And regarding the gold production, Ecuador has 960 concessions for the artisanal and small-scale miners. They represent 80% of the total annual production, and this is supposed to change drastically once large-scale mining companies start operation. The main problems in the ASGM sector include, as the most important, the lack of access to finance, which leads to low technology processes, and of course, the use of mercury. This in turn leads to low productivity, precarious and dangerous working conditions, and low rates of formalized miners. And next slide, please. This is the first part of our financial strategy, and it is the design of a financial mechanism, especially for the mining sector. This photo was taken when the Planet Gold projects from Colombia and Peru visited us to learn about the mechanism. Next slide, please. To start designing a financial mechanism, we needed some information about the miners' needs. So this is some of the data that we gathered during the study performing our 3 prioritized mining sectors. For example, in Camilo Ponce, where the total population is 22,000 inhabitants, 45% are women and 55% are men. And from those total number of from the total number of women in the canton, 33 live in the rural areas. 76% of the population of Camilo Ponce live with condition of poverty, and 33% live in extreme poverty conditions. And finally, 66% of the people working in the mining sector are men, while 34% are women. The numbers varied a bit in the other sectors. However, some important conclusions are that the poverty and extreme poverty percentages are very high, and the number of women involved in the mining sector is low. This and other social information is, of course, very important if you want to design a financial product that helps a specific group of people. Next slide, please. And regarding the access to finance in our mining sectors, we know that 49% of Ecuadorians over 15 years old do not have any type of accounts in the country's financial system. This condition is even worse in the rural areas, where 52% of the population are in a situation of financial exclusion. In rural areas where our project operates, only 7% of people have access to some type of credit. But all of the miners we interviewed wanted credit. And the main reasons why they did not request a loan were because they did not have guarantees, the proper guarantees, or they lacked the proper information. Currently, 72% of those surveyed miners said that they do require financing, and that they will use it mainly for the acquisition of machinery and tools. The minimum amount that the miners need to expand or to start a proper operation is $50,000, and according to their cash flows, they can pay this in 2 or 3 years. In some cases, it was much less than that, actually. Next slide, please. So during our study, we found some barriers, including the issue that there are no financial products according to the dynamics of the ASGM sector. Miners do not have credit history, and they also do not have proper guarantees. These barriers cause that the financial sector has a perception of high risk towards the mining sector. But the truth is that even though miners don't have proper guarantees, their cash flow is very large, and they are able to pay for credits in very short periods of time. So once we understood this, what we proposed was to use an existing financial mechanism that Ban Ecuador, a public bank, had for the agricultural sector and adapted to the needs of the ASGM sector. But as a way to reduce the risk of the operation, we involved the central bank who in Ecuador buys the gold from the artisanal miners and has a historical record of their operation and the capital flows that each one of them manages. Next slide, please. So in short, what we managed to create was a financial product ranging from $500 to $2 million. It works through the agreement between the two public banks. The central bank provides Ban Ecuador with the information on the miner or group of miners requesting the loan. Ban Ecuador, depending on the information received, approves the credit. The applicant must open an account in Ban Ecuador and use the money from the loan for the proposed improvement, for which they will have assistance from the chemical program. And then they have to sell the gold to the central bank. And this later bank, the central bank, will pay and deposit in the applicant's account. So finally, Ban Ecuador will retain the corresponding payments. So it's a closed circle. Next slide, please. And that was for the financial mechanism, very quick. And this is the other line of work that we are implementing to support the artisanal mining sector, and especially the most vulnerable, which are the women, or rancheras, as we call them here in Ecuador, and the elderly. It is important to say that women in the mining sectors carry out work only on the waste mineral that male miners discard. So they do not work directly in mines. That is, they make a classification in the mineral dump sites, trying to find traces of gold in the mineral that men have discarded due to its poverty. Next slide, please. And with the above in mind, when we started working with the rancheras, we had to identify the barriers that exist from them to have an improvement in their economy. So some of those problems are the lack of access to education, the low monthly profit that they have. A big issue is that they are not recognized by the mining law, and also the poor quality of the mineral that they work with it's among the other problems. And with this information, we designed a competitive fund mechanism to help them improve and develop alternative livelihoods. So what we proposed are $50,000 projects that promote alternatives to mining and are sustainable, replicable, and involve communities. Next slide, please. And we are supporting at the moment 2 projects, and this is one of them. This is a project to support the development of community gardens. We reached an agreement with the decentralized autonomous government of Camilo Ponce Enriquez, and they donated the space for the construction of 40 grow beds, a nursery garden, and a chicken farm. We are also strengthening capacities related to the agricultural good practices, commercialization, marketing, accounting, and leadership. This project involves 21 rancheras, and we calculated the reduction of mercury due to the change in the economic activity of this woman in around 10 kilograms per month, which is important. Next slide, please. And this is the second project that we are supporting, and it supports the equipping of a goldsmithing workshop in which the artisans will be women from the mining communities of Portobelo, and who will use the material produced in their area to make jewelry. We reached an agreement also with the Association of Small-Scale Processing Plants of Portobelo, who donated the building where the workshop will operate. We also support training, a training plan on the generation of new businesses, promotion and identification of good practices that enhance their activity. And we are still estimating the impact of this alternative livelihood in the use of mercury. And I'm sorry to say that I don't have that information yet, but I'm guessing it goes around the same amount as the other project. Next slide, please. And These are some of the lessons learned of both activities. I will not go through all of them due to the time, but I would like to mention that the administrative time of both activities have been very long, and this is something that must be considered during the design of any initiative. Also, in order to improve access to finance, it is extremely effective to have a good understanding of the sector's needs and the financial entities' concerns. Only with this information, we can be able to design an adequate product that are beneficial for all the parties involved. Next slide, please. And this is, well, this is all I wanted to share. I hope it was useful, and thank you very much.
Mario, thanks so much. That really complemented well Dewey's presentation from Indonesia, and what you shared with us from Ecuador about the design and implementation of policies to increase access to funding, including through the competitive fund mechanism, was very informative, and that includes also some of the techniques you're using for risk mitigation involving the central bank. And I think also what resonated a lot in your presentation was came to in the second half of your presentation about supporting the transition as part of formalization, through training for goldsmithing, and this looking at the larger value chain. Thanks also for sharing some of the basic poverty and gender data from Ecuador. And that really sets us up well for our next speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Kirsten Dales, who is a senior ASGM expert for Planet Gold, to talk to us a bit more about a theme that we've already heard a few things about gender and mining. So with that, the floor is yours. Kirsten, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. And yes, just wanted to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me to present and participate. And my topic is extracting equality, gender, and mining. Next slide, please. As many of the colleagues have already presented here today with Planet Gold and the incoming Gold Plus, my discussion today will orient around formalization, financial inclusion, technical assistance to transition to Mercury through mercury-free adoption and diffusion of technology, as well as knowledge sharing and local capacity building. Because of the time, in terms of limitation, I'll give some high-level overviews with where relevant observations from the ground here in Kenya. Next slide, please.
Kirsten, apologies for jumping in so quickly. Could you try to speak up a little bit? We're having your volume for some reason a bit lower than the other presenters. Many thanks.
Okay, is this better?
Thanks, better, yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so before we jump in or delve into the topic of gender, we should define it. So gender is a socio-cultural norm that is acquired or learned over time. Because this occurs through a socialization process, it's socially constructed, and this is the difference that occurs between men, women, boys, and girls in mining communities and at mine sites. It's important to note that because this is socially constructed, is that it's dynamic and that gender can change in terms of its norms, inequalities, and opportunities for intervention. Next slide, please. So in terms of sustainable development goals, we do hear a lot about SDG 5, gender equality and why it matters. But the devil's in the details, usually is. And so to achieve gender equality, there is a focus on empowering women and girls due to historic imbalances. And why this matters is that women and girls actually represent at least 50% of the global population and therefore half of its potential. Unfortunately, gender equality persists everywhere and currently stagnates progress. Pardon me. Next slide, please. As one of the first UN agencies to have a comprehensive gender equality and mainstreaming plan, UNDP has had a focus on gender equality and its alleviation for many decades. Next slide, please. And in terms of the ASGM sector, we know that in mining in general, but in all livelihoods, women are overrepresented in informal and vulnerable employment, so that the risks extend well beyond the issue of chemical exposures, which was originally the focus of aspects of the Minamata Convention, provides a lot of awareness raising and opportunities, but we know that access to finance, formalization, and a host of other issues have gendered consequences. Next slide, please. So in terms of the distribution of impacts and benefits or risks and rewards, we can view the gold production chain stemming from artisanal, small, medium, and large scale. And what I'd like to note in this figure is that at the global level, we know that 30% on average is what accounts for the female workforce participation in the ASGM sector. But when we talk about artisanal mining versus small scale, women's labor force participation is usually higher. And what we see as we move along the production chain is that the number of women miners decreases. There's more usually involved in secondary processing, but the number of people overall in terms of employment from artisanal and small scale to the industrial scale decreases. But as we move across the production scale and increase mechanization, organization, and also formality, this has a range of different consequences, especially in terms of who would be left behind. And as I mentioned, artisanal miners are usually some of the most represented with women, as making them a vulnerable group. Next slide, please. And to design interventions that are gender responsive, we must analyze gender equality in the ASGM communities. And the previous discussion was provided some very useful data to inform decision-making and policy development, but that this is two-pronged. This includes gender disaggregated data that can include percentages of the workforce of women and men or the gender they identify with, as well as their role in the supply chain and corresponding salary levels. Of course, there's more sex disaggregated data that would focus more on biological or sex disaggregated differences in terms of risks to chemical exposures by virtue of biological attributes. So moving through some of the key topics that we've heard for the Planet Gold and Gold Plus program. Formalization is a process, as we've identified, and that efforts to formalize and regulate the sector are not only enshrined in the Minamata Convention on Mercury, but we've seen a proliferation, not just in gold ASM, but in all ASM sectors, with a number of donor that funded and interventions focused on formalization worldwide. And why I have a photo of land here is that often allocation of land with known geologic potential is seen as a key starting point for formalization. Next slide, please. And as you can see, Dewey discussed this very well in terms of formalization of the process. But we can see that in terms of the chain, is that the starting point for formalization, as I mentioned, does begin with land allocation and also a knowledge of geologic potential in order to then develop and access as well as exploit those resources effectively. Across the formalization process, gender equality is a cross-cutting theme that has to be considered at every step along the way in terms of the risks and also the rewards for men, women, boys, and girls. And we understand this by investigating gender identity factors among different ASGM actors to help understand what the gender-based risks are and develop mitigation measures to identify opportunities for advancing gender equality and enabling women's empowerment. Next slide, please. High-level gender dimensions in ASGM that have been accrued or observed throughout the world is often that we see that women can be invisible in the ASGM value and supply chain. Is women may not be perceived as minors, as indicated by the Hancheras in Ecuador, for instance, or the scavengers of ore. They're also not recognized in formalization processes, and that this can negate their socioeconomic contributions, even though they're not directly involved in extraction or mining. This often results in gender disaggregated access to benefits, resources and their benefits, as well as I mentioned formalization. And so in terms of an intervention strategy, advancing gender equality in formalization really can identify women as an emerging economy, but does require adequate safeguards to protect their full and adequate human rights, as well as advance their labor market potential. Next slide, please. In terms of financial inclusion, the last speaker, Mario, spoke on this quite well, but also the photo that I have here speaks to what Ludovic had identified in the beginning of the session, is that many miners are often also smallholder agricultural farmers. And often it can be much easier to gain credit and access to expand your banana plantation than to gain a concession. So financial inclusion is seen as a solution for the unbanked or people or entities that do not have access to affordable and appropriate services or products from the finance sector to meet their needs and have this delivered in a responsible way. As we heard, is that due to women's sometimes invisible role and also in general the reduced access to bank accounts and formal financial mechanisms, is that women can face recurrent and compound challenges in accessing finance, as well as so can artisanal miners or more of the non-mechanized production actors. Next slide, please. And in terms of, we're focusing on the issue or the opportunity in investing in women as an emerging economy, is investing, and there's a lot of evidence that supports this, is that women's economic empowerment and also their political participation in financial inclusion sets a direct path towards advancing gender equality, poverty eradication, as well as inclusive economic growth for the sector as whole. Next slide, please. On the topic of transition to mercury-free technologies, is facilitating the transition from mercury in ASGM production systems through the adoption and the subsequent diffusion of resource-efficient gravity concentration and leaching circuits is an extremely important, incredibly important, let's be honest, mechanism to not only reduce the risks and environmental impacts, but improve the overall perspective of the sector from downstream markets and the global consumer, as well as meet the global environmental benefits targeted in Planet Gold and Gold Plus. Next slide, please.
Kirsten, sorry to come in again. I know you're coming toward the end. If you could try to speak up again a bit louder and maybe be aware of your microphone, which might be causing some static in the background. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Okay, is this better?
Yes,
Yes,
much better.
Please go ahead.
Much better. Okay, my apologies. I think it was a technical malfunction with my microphone there. Okay, so very briefly, we can recount. So when we talk about interventions that can enhance the mechanization and production or throughput capacity within a community, I'd like to discuss from here in the Lake Victoria Goldfields in Western Kenya, of looking at the roles of what are the roles of women and men in the villages of Mikei, Osiri, and Kobobo in Western Kenya. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, women are often not directly seen as miners themselves. And in this particular context, the upsurge in terms of mechanization has the potential of leaving women behind. So in these villages, women comprise 38 to 50% of the workforce, but due to the gender division of labor and differential resources, is that they only access 11 to 15% of the mining revenues. Women are not allowed to go underground due to cultural myths and other forms of discrimination, and that they're not allowed also to access processing facilities, especially the reprocessing of tailings. My original photo showed a cyanidation tank, which has exploded throughout Western Kenya, and that very rarely are women ever allowed to have access to control to these facilities. And as well, unlike the rancheras, some of the women here are really advanced. They are scavenging tailings also, but they formed groups to crush batch process in rented mills, have now improved their sluice technology, and are over time reducing their reliance on mercury. However, breaking into the cyanidation or the more processed areas has been very difficult for women. And at the same time, as the primary collectors of water, cyanide contamination disproportionately affects women and girls that are required to do those tasks. Next slide, please. This is just an example of labor crushing that's manual in Kenya, and as increased milling technology has been adopted, is that these jobs are displaced from the value chain completely. Next slide, please. Here we can see, and Ludovic mentioned this in the very beginning, is that often we see massive losses in terms of the gold into the tailings. And we do see this also in many different parts of Kenya, meaning that unfortunately they're not improving their economic position as much as can be possible. Next slide, please. And as well, in many of the places that have been visited, Mercury is exclusively a women's role and that men do not engage in this activity. Next slide, please. However, due to lack of access to childcare, and especially during COVID school closures, unfortunately, we've seen a trend that women are increasingly teaching their children how to use Mercury or to bring it to the mine sites. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, in terms of when we talk about the adoption and diffusion of different technologies, the use of cyanide has exploded in Western Kenya, but that this ultimately diffused through informal means coming over from Tanzania. Unfortunately, this is an illegal practice in Kenya. And so in terms of upscaling throughput and improving production capacity, we have to be careful about when we talk about transitioning from mercury and not out of the frying pan into the fire in overly promoting irresponsible cyanide use. Next slide, please. And as the final item in terms of the Planet Gold and Gold Plus focus of components, knowledge sharing and capacity building, of course, is incredibly important, not just for national actors to enhance formalization, financial inclusion, and transition from mercury capacity, but to share experience among national as well as local actors. And in terms of having knowledge sharing communications and local capacity building efforts with a decentralized focus on human capital, which is the focus of Gold Plus, there has to be investments of looking at how to leave no miner behind. And what we mean with this, and from this picture here, is on the issue of child labor, for instance, men often would not come down from the mines to hear training on child labor, and this was targeted only at women. So how to engage not only men, but women actively as agents in advancing gender equality, and men are a very important role in this. Next slide, please. So as a summary, experience shows often that when we do not account for gender dimensions, that this can create negative, damaging, and unintended consequences for some of the most vulnerable populations, ultimately leaving artisanal miners behind. Next slide, please. And by not looking at the gender dimensions or considering gender as a cross-cutting theme and issue for all interventions in the ASGM sector, potential adverse impacts can include the worsening of power imbalances between women and men in formalization and organization efforts, the loss of economic opportunities for women, especially through increased mechanization processes or discriminatory practices where they're not allowed to access more lucrative roles, as well as disproportionate health burdens from mercury and chemical exposures. And unfortunately, when we do see some women gain access to mills or other equipment, that this does make them targets for different forms of gender-based violence as well. And looking at the potential for equal or unequal training opportunities or access to training or capacity building often does have a gendered nature and needs to be dealt with carefully in interventions. Next slide, please. And so in summary, in terms of extracting equality and some take-home messages is that yes, we do realize gender equality is not only about women's rights, but often women are being left behind in the ASGM supply and value chain. So advancing women's equal participation as decision makers in the formalization process can provide a positive contribution to this, as well as Planet Gold and Gold Plus. Empowering women to realize their full potential and either equal and full human rights in mineral value chains, not only supply chains, as well as looking at strategies to reduce gender inequalities in access to and control over resources, as well as their benefits. Take-home messages that have cross-cutting application for all of the major points that we discussed and components of these programs. So thank you for your time and look forward to discussion.
Thanks so much, Kirsten. That was excellent. And thanks, the sound came through much better in the second half of your presentation. You really did a great job of helping us understand more about gender differentiated vulnerabilities and barriers and the importance of many things, including gender and sex disaggregated data, access to finance for women and for men, and the overall formalization process. And it was great too, the examples and key takeaway messages that you shared, including from Kenya, and the village examples that you gave were very informative. So with that, we have a few minutes left for a bit more unscripted discussion. A big thanks to all participants who have been using the chat box and to our speakers who have been answering some of those questions in the chat box. I'm going to turn now back to our speakers and ask some of you to respond to some questions. And I would ask so that we can get as many in as possible, if you could try to limit your replies to just 1 or 2 minutes. Let's start, Susan, if you could tell us a bit more about the jurisdictional approach that you mentioned in your opening presentation. Over to you.
Thanks, Tim. I'll do my best. It's not my area of expertise. Our colleagues at Conservation International, who will lead the next phase of Planet Gold, have a lot of expertise on this topic, but I'll do my best to summarize. The notion is that at a subnational level, where this mining is really occurring, there's a number of different stakeholders and actors who are involved in determining land use, determining the permitting, even at a local level. There's a lot of traditional actors. There's economic interests, farmers, competing with miners, competing with other water users, et cetera. So the idea is to try to bring all of these stakeholders together into a common platform in order to really discuss and dialogue around finding very, very practical, locally based solutions to making sure that there's an enabling environment to support well-regulated and more environmentally friendly mining, and it can live in peace and harmony with all of the other necessary uses in the area. And of course, that kind of multi-stakeholder engagement is really a cornerstone of a lot of, interventions already. But the notion is this gives a more systematic platform and a kind of a methodology for doing so. And it really also benefits the downstream buyers of gold or other kinds of commodities where people are worried about the risks of how they were produced. By taking this geographic focus, those downstream buyers, if they know that there is a multi-stakeholder, multi-dimensional effort to ensure that that's a well-regulated environment, that gives comfort to the downstream buyers, so they know, they can feel good about buying gold or other products from that particular area. So it also, in addition to having practical solutions to the regulation of the use of that area, it also has these downstream kind of de-risking effects by allowing those folks to really feel like they're buying from an area that people have their eyes on. I hope that's a good enough summary.
That was great. You dealt very well with an impossible task, which is to summarize such an innovative area in a very succinct way. So many thanks for that. I'd like now to ask one or more other of our speakers to respond to the following 2 linked questions. The first is, or let's start with the first, and that is we've heard many examples of how important and impactful the Planet Gold program has been in phase 1 and soon to be phase 2 countries across many entry points for women, for local communities, through the jurisdictional approach, through the formalization process. And I think questions that are in many of our minds is, how can, aside from webinars like this, how can other countries and communities benefit from this same knowledge and these same approaches, even if they're not, part of that phase 1 or phase 2 country cohort. So maybe that's a question for anyone, but perhaps Ludovic or Susan, maybe you'd like to take that question.
Thank you. I can try to address a bit, and maybe Susan and Evelyn can add to that. Evelyn represents also the donor for the Planet Gold program. It is clear that we started Planet Gold with a group of 9 countries, well, 8 countries plus 1. Then we added another 8 countries, and now we're considering adding more. So that's one way to expand the program, is to get more projects. However, there's also a very important component, and the global projects which Susan is managing is there to disseminate information with the hope that especially in the terms of access to finance, the tools that we're using to transfer technology or to formalize the miners can be, they will be in the open for in the future, and anybody is welcome to use them to replicate. So, of course, we will have through the Planet Gold program a series of global forum where we will share experience regionally between the countries benefiting from the projects and neighboring countries, so that they can learn, they can hopefully already learn and use some of the tools that we are implementing. So the advantage of Planet Gold is really this global component, the website that we will maintain through the Global Mercury Partnership. So it will be something that will stay well beyond the lifetime of the program, so that people and the partners can access this information, either accessing then, implementing on their own, or accessing funding from third-party donors, or there's a lot of ways that we can replicate that. But the program itself has built-in exchange of information with neighboring countries.
Thanks so much, Ludovic. That was very helpful. And maybe then we can move to the final question for this webinar, and that's maybe I'll ask Mario or Dewey to come in, or Kirsten, if you'd like to, but just maybe one speaker to speak about. All of us have been coping in a personal and a professional way with the impact of COVID-19 and linked efforts to ensure a green recovery, building back in ways that are greener and more inclusive, despite some pressures maybe to do otherwise. So if one of you would like to come in and talk about some of the implications that the COVID context in particular challenges and opportunities very briefly on artisanal mining, that would be much appreciated. I see you've unmuted, Kirsten. Would you like to come in?
Okay, can I take it there, Tim?
Oh, please do, Dewey.
Oh, okay, sorry, Kristen.
First Dewey, then Kirsten, very briefly.
Okay, so we learned that because our project site is quite remote in Indonesia, that's during the COVID-19, we learned because last year the gold price is really high, but we are hypothesized that the disease will be impacting really good for our miner. Actually not, because this in the remote area with the COVID-19, the restriction traveling, about that actually the cash flow in the remote area is really hard. Actually, because you can imagine in the small island, the cash flow, the ship, the flight, it stopped. The cash flow to the site is really limited. So what the miners do, they only receive 50% from the gold price. And also the gold price, they're not benefiting at all from the increasing of the gold price, because no more additional labor. So they only use with whatever labor they do have. So fatigue it's happened, stress is happened, and they taking more all the money from what they use for the feeding the family. That's as a capital. This is really hard situation during the COVID. That's I can share the experience.
Thanks. So that was very informative. Kirsten, can you compliment?
Yes, so I think that the impacts have been diverse globally, but that certain trends have emerged in terms of ASM, ASGM, specifically communities, is gold markets are rallying, but supply chains had collapsed. And I think that especially in different parts of East Africa there's opportunities for resilience and recovery that is being driven out of communities, realizing that food security had become a huge issue, that many communities had drifted towards a higher reliance on mining. And that now, in wake of that, is that it's not an alternative livelihood, but looking more at creating resilience by diversifying income streams and trying to have a greater level of autonomy. An example of that is a women's savings and loan group that's come together very impressively, here in Kakamega in Kenya. They've diversified and improved their mining activities, but as well invested in guinea fowl to have a side business for poultry, for instance. And that only happened after the pandemic. So just as a positive example.
Thanks. And I know there's a wealth of more information that maybe we can get into in future webinars on this topic of gender and artisanal mining and the COVID-19 context. So thanks very much for that.
Can I add to that, Tim?
Very briefly, in just 1 minute, so we can keep on track and move to closing.
Yes, we engaged with an exercise with the World Bank to interview some of the miners and see what of the impacts of COVID-19 had been, and there were, I mean, we learned of great impacts on gender equality. The miners were aware of the increasing price of the gold internationally, but they were receiving much less per gram than before the pandemic, and this was all created by the COVID-19. I saw the question regarding green recovery, and I wanted to add to that the greatest risk, the economic pressure that losses due to the sanitary emergency, these losses that the sanitary emergency put on the government is the greatest risk on the ability of the countries to follow a green recovery path. And we all need to understand that a better way to start again is not only necessary for the environment and social reasons, but in truth is financially intelligent, and it could bring the creation of better and new green jobs and less, hopefully none, negative impacts. So we are in the obligation to support countries and decision-making stakeholders to see and understand this reality and take the path towards a green recovery.
Yes.
And that was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. Excellent points and well said. Let me now turn to our final speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Kasper Koefoed Hansen with UNDP to provide some final remarks. Kasper, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. We are beyond time, so I'll be short on this. Thanks for all the participants and the panelists that have been in this webinar today. I think it's been very interesting to hear about the ASGM sector. We heard that the ASGM sector plays an important role in many developing countries, both in terms of economic development and also in terms of employment. So we heard that up to 50 to 20 million miners work in this sector globally, and up to 100 million people depend on the sector if we include the families and the supply chain. So it's a hugely important sector and could potentially also play an important role in the green recovery. But we just heard about some of the challenges that are there. It's also an important sector because of the current uses of practices that ASGM miners are using on mercury. We heard that this sector represents 37% of the global mercury emissions. So we also heard in this webinar that the ASGM sector, with many of the current practices, is problematic for the environment, leading to high levels of pollution, land degradation, destruction of habitats, encroachment of protected areas, plus many other issues that could be listed around this sector. It's not just an environmental problem, we have social problems, we have gender problems. In some countries, it's also linked to organized crimes and other things that we have not discussed in this webinar today. But I think that part of the key messages of several of the presentations today is the importance of creating a more formal sector that can reverse the trends that we're currently seeing and find ways to minimize the negative impacts on the environment. We heard that the formalization and introduction of mercury-free methods can improve productivity dramatically. The example from Burkina Faso was interesting, where in the past with mercury they would achieve around 30%, retrieve around 30% of the gold with mercury, and with improved production methods, they were now able to get up to 60 to 70%. So this shows that it's without using chemicals. So it shows that not only is it better for the environment, but also drastically increases the livelihood of the miners and their families. The Planet Gold program has been an important platform for the work that the UN agencies and some NGOs have been doing in the ASGM sector. Susan presented the role of the global component, where lessons learned from many interesting activities in all the participating countries are being collected globally and then shared across the countries in order to improve the production methods, the formalization processes, the access to finance, etc. in different countries. From Indonesia, we heard about the big formalization program that is going on now, and how the flexibility in approaches is important to move towards this goal. We know that it's a very challenging one. In Ecuador, there were some interesting numbers about the state of the ASGM sector, the level of poverty that we see, the level of extreme poverty we see, and how the difficult access, the access to finance is currently in the sector. At the same time, Ecuador has also been the country that had advanced most in terms of access to finance to miners, and there have been some interesting developments in the countries. Mario described the competitive fund mechanisms, where we saw how the projects are also trying to develop alternative livelihoods for some women miners groups in the country, both in terms of with agriculture and in terms of goldsmithing. And finally, Kirsten gave some very interesting perspectives in how the gold mining sector is affecting the issues around gender and some of the risks that we are facing now, and the importance of being very clear about the inclusion of women in the work, so that we can have a more sustainable mining sector. I think from a UNDP perspective, this is a sector that is very important. The ASGM sector, these projects should not be seen just as environmental projects where you phase out a chemical, but these are much broader projects that looks into livelihoods, to poverty reduction, to improve local governance. And despite the challenges that there have been in this COVID period right now, where as Kirsten mentioned, the supply chains have collapsed, and despite a growing or increased gold price globally, miners are receiving every day a smaller fraction of that gold price. It is still a sector that potentially could be important for the green recovery, especially and help reactivating the rural areas of the countries where it's normally difficult to reach out in times of crisis. So with that, I'll stop my intervention and thank everybody for all the active participation in the webinar today. Thanks.
Thank you, Casper. Thanks for sharing those insightful and inspiring remarks. And a big thank you to all of our speakers and to all participants, of course, for today's rich discussion. We covered many topics and mined several nuggets of knowledge that will inform the new global framework. Just to remind, the recording of today's webinar and all presentations will be shared at the online link in the chat box. And a preview, the next webinar in our series will take place in May and focus again on gender and the Montreal Protocol. So stay tuned for more information on that. And with that, thank you and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.